All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are wading into some deep waters. We're talking about postmodernism. Now, this is an idea that has totally reshaped Western culture. And you know what? It's having a bigger and bigger impact right here in Nigeria. If we're going to minister effectively today, we've got to get our heads around this. So, let's jump right in. So, I want to start with this question. What happens when the world stops believing in big stories? And look, this isn't just some abstract thing for philosophy classroom. This is a real, on-the-ground challenge for every single one of us as Christian leaders in the 21st century. And to even begin to answer it, we have to understand this thing called the postmodern turn, this really deep cultural shift away from all the old certainties.
You see, to really get a handle on postmodernism, we first have to look at what it was reacting against, and that's the modern world. Modernity wasn't just a period in history. It was a massive project, a really confident story about humanity and where we were all headed.
On one hand, you had modernism. It promised this amazing future built on things like universal reason, scientific progress, and individual freedom. I mean, it was an era of incredible optimism. But then postmodern thinkers started to look closer, and they began to see some cracks in that foundation. They started asking questions like, hey, are these universal truths really universal for everybody? Or are they just the story of one specific culture? A story that maybe silences a whole lot of other people?
Right at the heart of this whole critique is this concept of the meta-narrative. It's a fancy word, but the idea is pretty simple. These are the big, grand stories that a culture tells itself to make sense of everything. Stories about progress, or reason, or even salvation. And the French philosopher Jean-François Lyotard, he famously argued that in our time, these huge, all-encompassing stories are just losing their grip on people.
This quote really gets to the core of it. Postmodernism is, at its heart, this deep suspicion, this incredulity towards any single story that claims to have all the answers, whether it's coming from science or politics or, yes, even religion. This skepticism, this is the earthquake that really shook the foundations of Western thinking. And listen, this postmodern earthquake didn't just shake up philosophy and politics. Oh no, it went way deeper. It started challenging our very idea of what knowledge is, what truth is, even inside the world of science.
A really key figure here was a guy named Thomas Kuhn. He wrote this incredibly influential book, and in it, he basically argued that science doesn't just neatly pile up facts one on top of the other. No. He said instead it goes through these radical, jarring shifts in how it even sees the world. Kuhn gave this a name, a paradigm shift. A great example is the shift from thinking the Earth was the center of the universe to understanding that it orbits the sun. See, that wasn't just adding one new fact to the pile. It was a completely new way of seeing everything. It was like putting on a new pair of glasses. The very meaning of words like planet had to change.
And here is where it gets really crucial for us. Kuhn's idea kind of opened the door for other thinkers, like Richard Rorty, to argue that maybe truth isn't about perfectly describing reality out there. Maybe, they said, truth is just what works for a specific group of people. And you can see how this is a massive challenge for us in ministry, right? How in the world do we share the timeless, unchanging truth of the gospel with a generation that's been taught that all truth is relative, that it's just something we make up?
Okay, so if truth isn't something we discover, but something we create, then the very next question has to be, why? Why do we create it? Well, postmodern thinkers had some pretty unsettling answers, and they almost all circle back to one single word: power.
So let's look at two of the most powerful tools in the postmodern toolbox. First up is from a French philosopher named Michel Foucault. He gave us something called genealogy. It's like being a detective, digging into the history of an idea, not to see if it's true, but to ask, who benefits from this? How has this been used to control people? The second tool comes from Jacques Derrida. He developed deconstruction, which is a way of reading things super closely to show how language itself is always slippery and unstable.
Foucault's huge idea was that knowledge and power are basically two sides of the same coin. He even created a new word for it: power/knowledge. From his perspective, what a society calls truth is very often just a system to keep control. Just think about how the definition of something like madness has changed over history, and how that definition was used to lock people up and silence their voices.
And man, this one hits us right where we live as the church. When we stand up and proclaim the gospel as the truth, a postmodern mind is immediately going to be suspicious. They're trained to ask, okay, whose power does that truth serve? Is this claim to absolute truth really about setting people free? Or is it just another system of control? That is a question we absolutely have to be ready to answer. So postmodernism didn't just stop with these big abstract ideas like truth and power. It also turned its gaze inward to the individual. And it started asking some very, very personal questions. Who are you? I mean, who are you really? And is there even a stable, real you in there to be found in the first place? Foucault, for instance, he saw the self not as something you go and discover, but as something you create, almost like a work of art. You are who you decide to be. Now, the Christian vision of the self could not be more different. We believe our true identity isn't something we invent out of thin air. It's something we receive as a precious gift from God. We find out who we truly are in our relationship with Jesus Christ, and we're shaped by following him, by taking up our cross, even when, and especially when, it's hard.
Okay, so what in the world do we do with all of this? When you're faced with this level of deep suspicion about truth, about authority, even about the idea of who you are, how can we, as Christian leaders, possibly move forward? How can we stay faithful to the gospel in this new and frankly very challenging landscape?
Well, here's the good news. We don't have to choose between a rigid, old-fashioned modernism on one side and a cynical, skeptical postmodernism on the other. There is a better way. We can actually learn from the valid points that postmodernism makes without ever letting go of the core, life-changing truths of the gospel. In fact, Christian thinkers have been mapping out a path that isn't modern, isn't postmodern, but is something else entirely.
So what does this faithful path forward actually look like? Well, here are 3 really crucial steps. First, we have to listen with humility. We just have to be honest and admit that sometimes the church has gotten it wrong. We've misused our power and we've hurt people in the name of truth. Second, we have to ground our faith in our community. Truth isn't something one person figures out alone in a room. It's something we live out together, guided by the scriptures and the wisdom of the church through the ages. And third, we need to present the gospel for what it is, a gift. It's not another human philosophy, it's not another system of control, it is the good news of God's amazing grace, a gift that can only be received with open hands.
So this is it. This is our great challenge as Christian leaders in Nigeria today. In a world that's become so skeptical of all the big stories, we are called to tell the greatest story of all, the meta-narrative of Scripture. Our task is to tell it and to live it in such a way that people see it's not a story about power and control. It's a story about God's liberating grace that sets every single one of us free. Thank you for joining me for this explainer.